Welcome to our second panel as part of the once ever spring residency of the International Writing Program. For those who are watching at home, as always, the writers' biographies and samples of their work can be found at iwp.uiowa.edu. The panel presentations arrive a little bit later in the day. Today we're going to talk about writing the non-self, the not-self. Writers often create characters different from themselves in one way or another. When such a character is depicted as belonging to a distinct, recognizable group, perhaps a minority, what is the writer's responsibility toward representing the other accurately, if any? In this country, we have had many examples over recent years where someone writing from outside a certain group has assumed a personality that doesn't always go over very well once the book has been released to the public. And so in one way or another, we're trying to understand what the boundaries of imaginative engagement and sympathy might be. Our distinguished panelists from my left all the way down, and who will speak in order. IGOV, Bulgarian fiction writer, translator, scholar, and critic. He's the author of 3 novels and 2 collections of short stories. His 2015 novel, The Meek, examining social upheaval at the end of World War II, was especially well received in both Bulgaria and Germany, where it was published in 2019. He actively translates fiction and poetry from English and teaches English literature and translation at Sofia University. His participation in this spring residency was made possible by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Walid HAJAR RACHEDI, who comes to us from Paris, France, has long been passionate about stories that cut across cultural and linguistic barriers and new formats. In 2012, he launched an innovative transmedia campaign around his novel, Runaway. He is the co-founder and managing editor of the online magazine Frictions and Epidemics, a fiction podcast he co-produced, was shortlisted for the 2020 Paris Podcast Festival. His collection of short stories, Musical Chairs, was awarded the Grande École Literary Prize, and his most recent novel, What Would I Do in Paradise, published earlier this year, is now longlisted for Le Prix Orange de Livre and shortlisted for the Prix Goncourt de Premier Roman for the first novel. His participation was made possible by the U.S. Embassy in Paris. Next to him is Sara JARAMILLO KLINKERT, who has worked for numerous newspapers and major media channels in her native Colombia. Her autobiographical novel, How I Killed My Father, came out in 2019. A second novel, Where the Whales Sing, appeared in 2021. She holds an MA from Escuela de Escritores in Madrid and lives in Medellin, where she also owns a spice shop called Open Sesame. Her participation was made possible by the U.S. Embassy in Bogota. And finally, we have Shehan KARUNATILAKA, whose novel Cinnamon, The Legend of Pradeep Matho, won the 2012 Commonwealth Book Prize, the 2012 DSC Prize for South Asian Literature, and the 2008 Gratian Prize. His second novel, Chats with the Dead, a black comedy about ghosts, came out last year, as did a children's book, Please Don't Put That in Your Mouth. An ad man by trade, Shehan has also written on sports, music, and travel for The Guardian, Rolling Stone, GQ, Condé Nast, and National Geographic. He works in Singapore and lives in Colombo with a wife and 2 children, 4 guitars, and 27 unfinished stories. His participation was made possible by the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. So before we proceed to writing the Notself, let me tell you that as a kid, I was obsessed with doorknobs. I would go around the floors of the apartment building I lived, examining my neighbors' knobs, until I knew them all, type, color, face. In my imagination, the knob was more or less the door's face, with a nose aquiline or plump, with a tightly shut mouth, unwilling to reveal its secrets. My obsession did not have anything to do with break-in plans, or maybe in a way it did, as I was curious to know what life was like if you were living behind this or that door. And I cast myself in the role of my neighbors. The knob stood for somebody else's life. It was a symbol of otherness that could yet be explored, or at least imagined. This weird obsession did not last long, and as I grew up, I all but forgot about it. My memory of it came back when I started writing my first short stories, and I was struck by the uncanny realization that I was experiencing something quite similar. I was living bits and pieces of other people's lives, only now I had the tools for putting these fantasies down to paper. As it happened, I wrote a short story about the doorknobs too. It's titled Self, but it's actually about the tantalizing possibility of being other. What if you lived behind one of those doors? What if you lived in another place, another time? What if you could cast yourself as the character of a novel? I believe this sort of what if is what makes us read fiction in the first place. And in many cases, not necessarily in all cases, this is what drives writers in creating their own fictional worlds, alive with not selves that we reach out to by way of imagination and empathy. That's very much what literature is about, for me at least, experiencing the other. First, as a reader, embarking on 1,000 different voyages to other places or even other worlds, to meet people who are very different, or may not even be people, but rather animals, aliens, gods, trees, or rivers. Then, as a translator, by definition transferring, transposing, transcoding the product of somebody else's mind in another language, culture, and time. Finally, as a writer, quite literally adopting somebody else's voice, imagining oneself as the not-self, which must be such a basic human need if we only look at children's play. In this, writers are very much like children, I think. Yet their own play has the advantage of being interesting for others. I expect some of you would argue that literature can also serve as a way to express your own identity, which is in essence the romantic project of literature and most arts. Yet think about that. In its usefulness as a tool to affirm identity, along with other arts and media, with lifestyle and politics, literature is not unique. But in its capacity to nurture imagination and empathy, it probably is. I am not saying that writing the not-self is an innocent occupation. Nothing is innocent, not even children's play. Of course, it's an activity containing the seeds of what we call imperialism of the imagination. The writer assumes the voice of another person without asking for permission. It is the moral responsibility of an author to speak for rather than instead of others, and thus establish a democracy rather than an empire on the plane of imagination. Obviously, that is valid for fiction writers more than it is for poets. Yet poetry in its own way is also very often about writing the not-self. For poetry is unique in probing and testing the limits of the self, to the point where the self is not the self anymore, but transforms or dissolves or even explodes. Who should be the witness here but Rimbaud, with his famous phrase, je hais un autre, I is someone else. his wild whim to cast himself as a fantastic drunken boat, and finally his decision to erase Rimbaud the poet from his own life, which was an extremely poetic gesture in its own right. So far from being complacent, it shows how writing the not-self can actually be quite dangerous. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So thanks again for having me here, IWP program. And I'm very glad to talk about this topic, and I think it's actually something I couldn't have written before what happened actually this year with the publication. And for me, it's an important text because it kind of like summarizes a lot of thoughts that are on the topic for like maybe 15 years. For me, literature has always represented, it's called Is There Any Magic Left? For me, literature has always represented the possibility of exploring other realities. When I was a kid, I was an avid reader fascinated by the power of stories, and the ones capable of crafting them were true magicians to me. My desire to write initially came as I realized very early that I was observing things with a unique perspective. I grew up on the outskirts of Paris to Algerian parents that spoke French at home. I was a banlieue teenager, too nerdy to meet the thug stereotype. Then I became a class defector, transfuge, when I went to Paris for my studies. This type of journey was not reflected in the literature I could read. Does this book even exist? I recall asking myself. At first, I tried to make sense of the worlds I was passing through, imagining the lives of the people I met on the RER train that linked Paris to its outskirts. At the time, a first-time novelist whom I could identify with, Rachid Jaidani, published a pretty successful book. But when he was invited on TV, it was obvious that he was not taken seriously as a writer. At best, he was seen as a designated witness of his social context. More than once, the journalist asked him if he really had written the novel. It traumatized me. I decided to write stories setting characters very different from me to prove to myself that I can be a real writer. I wanted to reconnect with the magic of the unknown worlds of my childhood readings. And at the same time, Jean-Paul Sartre's writing questioned me a lot when speaking of Richard Wright. He said, can one be an African-American in the 1960s and not talk about segregation? And I still wonder, can one be French of North African origin in the years 2010-2020 and not speak from this position? Along with Jean-Paul Sartre, the other source of reflection at the time was my reading of Milan Kundera. For Kundera, the novelistic form must prevail over the message, always. For 10 years, I tried to find the right balance between these two visions of literature, mixing characters, tones, and stories. My first manuscript, Chaises musicales, musical chairs, for which I won the Prix littéraire des grandes écoles in 2007, bore this ambition. Later, it became a novel that interested many renowned publishers, but none of them would give it a real shot. Some told me to develop more characters from immigrant background as if I were not capable of writing anything else. Worst, my stories seemed more harshly criticized when they involved middle-class white characters. Once, the director of a renowned publishing house told me bluntly, is there a market for that? As the years went by, the position I was writing from was getting even trickier. After living a few years abroad, when I came back to France, I felt disconnected from the realities I depicted at first. I had also become other to the others. But in 2015, in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo and Bataclan attacks, I felt the urge to write. I understood that the trauma caused by Islamist terrorism led to the fear of Islam. I also knew that a majority of French Muslims found elevation, dignity, and purpose through their religious practice. This story needed to be told. And I realized that there were not so many of us who could summon this famous double consciousness stated by the African-American writer and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois to tell in a consistent and intimate way. That is how emerged the story of Malek, the main character of What I Would Do in Paradise, my debut novel published this year. His quest for purpose leads him to go and see the world with his own eyes, from Paris to London, passing by North Africa and the Middle East. As a writer, the challenge was not only to make Malek's quest intelligible, but also to tell the story of the others. Atik and Wazim, the Afghan twins aka the Middle East made chaotic by foreign intervention, and Jeffrey, the NGO director aka the West that thought it was doing the right thing. If Malek is the one who carries the novel, the two other voices were for me just as important and fed my idea about the clash of narratives. We are prisoners of our narratives, of our vision of the world, and how to grieve it without betraying ourselves and our loved ones. In this novel, despite what one can imagine, the intimate dimension has not much to do with the question of French-Algerian identity, but more with personal and existential events, loss, mourning, the impossibility of rebuilding things identically, the inability to find a new narrative of oneself and the world. And I do believe that what binds us, whether we come from Paris, Kabul, London, Algiers, or Iowa City. And that's what fascinates me, the magic.
Hello, thank you everybody for coming here, and thank you for having me. I'm gonna talk about crossing the river. Because I am a writer, I'm approaching this panel by telling you a story. It is about a young author who published her first novel in Colombia. The book was praised by critics and turned out to be a bestseller. Translation rights into many languages were quickly sold. Not surprisingly, it narrates in exquisite prose the journey of a woman whose adopted son wants to meet his biological mother. The woman they were visiting lived in an isolated jungle territory that could only be reached by traveling upriver on a boat. The synopsis itself is striking, right? Attention, here comes the twist of the plot. The story happens in a real territory called Chocó. The river exists, and is called Atrato. The book is inspired by a real event, a massacre. Are you wondering what the problem is then? The problem is that most people of Chocó are black, and the author, she's white. Here are some relevant details. The author knows the territory well because she lived there for 10 years. The main character of the novel is a white woman who adopted a black child, and the story is told from her point of view. The massacre is the only real thing in the novel. The rest is fiction. Yet the people of Chocó did not forgive their territory, river, and massacre narrated by a white writer. Several black cultural leaders have gone further than that. They accused the novel of racism, which generated a media scandal. Here are some personal opinions. I studied journalism and practiced the trade for more than 10 years. So I understand that it is crucial to describe reality accurately, objectively, if such a thing exists, with balance between sources and without reflecting personal opinions. But it happens that the novel we are talking about is fiction, so I'm giving my opinion not as a journalist, but as a fiction writer. I think a fiction writer should be concerned with telling a story in the best possible way for it to engaging and interesting for readers. Does this mean that there are no limits when writing? Yes, there are limits, but you can always cross the river, knowing that it's your responsibility as a writer to set them by asking yourself if you are in position to write about this or that ethnic group or territory without falling into stereotypes or cultural appropriation. That's called being professional. You may have realized I didn't bring this topic today because I have answers to offer you. On the contrary, I brought it because the more I think about it, the more questions I have. And I think it's important that you too question yourself about it. Is this a case of cultural cancellation? Are there borders that storytellers should not cross? When is freedom of expression violated? What is the limit between freedom of expression and disrespect for others? Is it possible to write the Notself without hurting others' feelings? You will tell me, because I still need to keep thinking about it. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. I'm going to put on someone else's hat before I read this. But first, thanks for coming out. I know it's an action-packed weekend, and there are lots of things happening, so appreciate you making the time to come and listen to us. Other people's hats, writing the not-self. So I'll start with a fairly obvious point. Unless you're writing a memoir, most writing is the exploration of the not-self. If I can paraphrase Harold Bloom, we read to get out of our own heads, and we write to get into other people's. The act of fiction is to interrogate the imagination, to ask questions such as, what's it like to be a murderer, a geisha, a prisoner, or a genius? The skilled writer can get readers to empathize with characters vastly different from themselves. An honest writer can wear different hats, see through different lenses, and faithfully report what they find. In recent decades, the freedom to roam our imaginations has encountered border controls and visa requirements centered around one thorny issue: permission. Are we allowed to try on any hat we like, speak with anyone's tongue, or put on someone else's dress? And the big question, if we are fair-skinned, do we have permission to twerk? The Guardian's got a big debate on this subject. You can check it out. But the most famous manifesto in this culture war came from Lionel Shriver, which he delivered at a lit fest in Australia wearing a sombrero. The 2016 speech and its backlash, well documented and stoked by The Guardian, threw up many questions. Among them, this one. When a white male author writes as a young Nigerian girl, is it an act of empathy or identity theft? So I had to confront none of these questions with my first novel, Chinaman. I was a 32-year-old Sinhalese male writing in the voice of a 64-year-old Sinhalese drunk. So it wasn't too much of a stretch, and I did my research well, and no one took offense. In fact, sadly, middle-aged drunk men now form a core of my audience. As Stephen the King says, give me enough information so that I can lie convincingly. My second book featured a war photographer, gambler, and closet gay protagonist. I could YouTube my way through Kodachrome photography, bluff my way at being a card shark, but was I, a cisgender hetero, allowed to write from the point of view of a closeted gay Sri Lankan man? In Hollywood, we used to have Charlton Heston in shoe polish playing the Mexicano, a brown Peter Sellers doing goodness gracious me, and most egregiously, Mickey Rooney playing Mr. Yuniyoshi in the iconic Breakfast at Tiffany's. But these days, we have period pieces with people of color sitting on thrones, and Bangladeshis and Puerto Ricans get to play themselves. Some say we've come so far, others that perhaps we've gone too far. The Netflix documentary Disclosure, which is still on and I highly recommend it, I found it quite eye-opening and moving, and it features transgender actresses complaining that the only roles that they get are as dead prostitutes on CSI whatever, or as the gender-confused serial killer who snuffs them. Whenever there is a complex, well-written trans role that comes up, of course it goes to Eddie Redmayne and Jared Leto, who then, when it's time to accept their awards, they grow beards and hetero up before they get the Oscars. And this was a complaint, and well, it should be. So should a white male author write as a young Nigerian girl when young female African writers are ignored by the publishing industry? Now, this is, of course, a straw man argument, but I fear it's one that I may have to face with a story that I'm thinking of. So there haven't been many convincing stories of Sri Lanka's war because of what I think is the protagonist problem. There were no good guys in our war, perhaps there are none in any. Maybe the only truth teller in Sri Lanka's war would be an innocent who survived the crossfire. So for over a decade, I have waited for a Sri Lankan Anne Frank to emerge from our carnage, but none so far. And as a father of a 7-year-old daughter, I'm aware of one startling fact. 7-year-old girls have more depth, originality, and soul than your average 30-year-old man. It's true. So must I stay in my lane and write about drunk middle-aged bores? Or, if no one else is writing the Sri Lanka's Anne Frank story, may I? The challenge for a Sinhala male from Colombo to speak in the voice of a Tamil girl in the war zone is immense. Some may say not worth attempting. But are there really these uncrossable boundaries in our dreamscapes? May I write as an old lady, a torture victim, a blind savant, or a half-Israeli, half-Palestinian, two-spirit pansexual? My response, which I guess makes me Team Shriver, is why ever the hell not? We despise our shoe-polish Hestons and our yellow-faced Roonies because it is clear that neither actor nor filmmaker had any regard for or interest in the character they were portraying. As author of Little Bee, Chris Cleave conceded, do I as an Englishman have any right to write a story of a Nigerian woman? I completely sympathize with people who say I have no right to do this. My only excuse is that I do it well. And this, I would submit, is the only rule here. If you're gonna write the not-self, especially a flawed not-self or less privileged not-self, you must do the homework, understand the voice, and be true to what it tells you. So my appeal, my wish for everyone is to go forth, explore all the not-selves that haunt you or move you, even the problematic ones. But do it with skill, diligence, and with a well-tuned ear. If the hat fits, try it on. But just make sure you know enough before you attempt to lie. Thanks.
Thank you all. These presentations week by week are always so inspiring and challenging, and I'm going to guess that people have some questions or comments they want to make. Make sure that we have a microphone somewhere, I think. The microphone's getting turned on. And while we wait for you to assemble your questions, maybe I'll just start, and I think each of the four of you might want to address this. The final paragraph of Shanan's talk, it has to do with having the skill to do this, to pull it off. And I love the quote from the British writer. What is that skill set? What does it consist of? How do you come to know a character who's not you, who's in some cases profoundly other? How do you bring them to life in a believable way, not in a Mickey Rooney-ish way?
I'm not sure I could explain this, and I'm not sure you could be aware of it in the process of writing. You're trying to do something right, and maybe you're able to, maybe you're not, and maybe you only realize that after you've written your text and maybe published it. So it is, as she has said, it's definitely a big challenge, and it's a huge risk. But I believe it's a risk that writers should take. So I really do believe that there shouldn't be borders that writers or shouldn't cross. But I also think that if as a writer you've decided to cross a certain border, well, you need to be aware of the risks as well. Yeah, it's your responsibility and your own risk.
You have to make sure you have the visa.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you've got to earn that visa. And because I'm always like insecure that I don't know enough about the story. And so with the first book, I hung out with drunk old men for like a good 6 months in the afternoons. And I was talking to them about cricket, but I was also just watching their mannerisms and the language they used. And sometimes I'd visit them at their houses to talk about cricket, but I'd notice how their wives would come in and serve the tea and their interactions. And so, I mean, that was the fun bit. So with the other one, I mean, I didn't go into war zones and all that, but I think sometimes the research can be a procrastination. So I spent like 2 years doing it, but I think you get to the point where you can shoot from the hip. So if I do attempt this Anne Frank story, I guess I'll be hanging out with my daughter more. Everyone will think I'm being a great father, but I'll be basically exploiting her. But I think, you have to, I mean, unless you're really, really skilled, which some writers are, they can sit in Iowa and write about anywhere in the world. But I feel I have the need to actually hear that character speak, and usually in person if you can. So then you can, it is a con game really, but then you're doing it well. I think that the risk is if you think you know everything and yeah, you try and just put your thoughts, put your words in characters' mouths.
I think as a writer, you always know. You always have that feeling, oh, this is working, or I don't know why this is not working. You always have that sensation when writing. But I think there are no that precise formula you can follow to check if you are doing it well or not. So what you have to do is to listen your inner voice. For example, I remember when I'm working here in my third novel. I remember when I started working on it a few years ago, I had a character who didn't work, and I didn't know why. And I tried, and it didn't work. And finally, I realized that it's because he was a man very different from me. So I turned that character into a woman, and it started to work immediately. So yeah, I think the advice is to listen. You always know. Inside of you, there's a voice telling you, oh, you have to pay attention. It's working or it's not working.
Yeah, if I add something on that, because everything has been said, but yeah, I believe that literature is a school of empathy. So it's about like being empathetic to people that are actually different from you. And actually, when you start to write a story, what you do is not a monologue. You start a conversation with people you don't know. So it's like, how can you actually start a conversation with someone you don't know if you are not having empathy? And for me, I mean, to be more in the process, because we're talking more about legitimacy on writing on this, on that. I mean, okay, it's a debate, but in the end, it's like how you do it. So for me, it's more like, it starts with a voice. It's like, do I hear the character? And sometimes it can be just like being in the subway or a conversation with someone, and very small sentence, and suddenly it's like, the character is here. For instance, when I was living in New York, I had this friend who was a Frenchman, Jewish, and our parents came from the same side of the world, Algeria, but his roots are Jewish and mine are Muslim. And at some point, we had like in common the passion for Latin America, and so we are very good friends, and he was the very first person in my life that I was really pro-Israeli. It's like, I knew in France, it's very like complicated to speak about the issue. So most of the time, people are trying to be like very consensual, saying, "Oh, two-state solution," and everybody has a, I don't know, has a voice in that, etc. But he was really pro-Israel, and it was the first time that actually I was actually meeting this kind of person. So for me, it was super interesting. And at some point at lunch a day, I asked him, "Ariel, do you think that you could marry a non-Jewish girl?" Because he was dating a lot of girls, he was quite a sexual man. So, and he told me that very like striking sentence. He told me, "Who am I to betray 5,000 years of history?" I said, "Wow." And that's something that if I wanted to portray, actually I portrayed in the other novel, A French Jewish Man. It's a sentence that they could not invent, because that's absolutely not the way I think. I think that I'm absolutely free, and I'm free to design who I want to be. That's actually one thing that was maybe my most French feature is that. And it's like, I believe that you can redefine yourself constantly.
Great. I think, John?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, and you have to use the mic, or else the people on the TV won't hear it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I really have to read everybody's work here. You guys are so interesting. You guys are amazing. I just want to say, pertaining to, I love what somebody said about writing. It's not instead of the community, but writing for them. I feel like it's, especially from my part of the world, where a lot of our oral history, or a lot of our history, oral, and not written. So when we have foreigners, especially white historians or academics, writing, a lot of things are lost, a lot of depictions are racist and all of that. So we who are trying to... Okay. So and this might seem not important as of like 100 years ago, but now that people like me are trying to research some of our histories, what we have is a very, thwarted, perspective or racist or incomplete versions, because these people were writing with their biases. So I would say if you are writing the Notself, you have to first of all do the internal work of being self-aware and understanding power dynamics that you have in relation to those people. I think you end up doing a more honest work if you, first of all think about yourself, or the reason why you want to, I as a man want to write as a book of a woman, what kind of internal work have I done? And then the second thing is there might be some kind of, I think what companies would call corporate responsibility or whatever, like in shepherding how the work moves in the world. We have the loss of Sunday now, who is a very gifted writer. She's a young Nigerian woman who did a short story in Nigerian Pidgin English that was featured on the Paris Review, which is the first of that kind of occurrence, because the Paris Review doesn't publish those kind of languages on its site. And it was not in Wikileaks, which is a problem that many publishers, Nigerians have with Western publishers. Like, it was just delivered as it was. And she was writing about a gay man and his relationship. So, and this way, like lower class gay people. And when that story was published, now, of course, one would argue it's not her place to write about this, because she is at least middle class, upper class, and she's writing about poor gay people in the country. But what she did was, the Paris Review made the platform free, made the short story free. So there was this huge uprising in Nigeria, because many people in buses or the road were having access, or queer people who couldn't afford to pay for Paris Review could have access to that story to see themselves represented. So when you have these stories of stories written about Africa, they are behind paywalls or they are locked up in journals, and then the people that are being written about don't have access to those spaces, that can be problematic. So if we choose to decide to write about the Notself, especially when they are of less power than us, we might want to look at how they are written about, and then how we also shepherd the accessibility, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So,
yeah. I think we're changing a battery right now.
Yeah, meanwhile, can I just say that DJ touched on something important here. These days, writers are often accused of adopting somebody else's voice that they shouldn't. But aren't we actually sometimes, don't we have the moral obligation to speak for somebody? Because there might be stories that will never be told if people from outside don't start telling them.
Hi. I have two questions. Is that okay? The first question is, what do you think about sensitive reading? I see that a lot in Brazil, where people from minorities, they are willing to read other people's works. For example, a black woman's willing to read a white man's work who's writing about a black woman, and tell him, oh, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, or you depict this in the wrong way. Do you think this is a way of making the writing the Notself work, or do you think it, what's your opinion on that? And the second, can I make the second?
Yeah.
And the second question is, if you know that some voices can't be heard, as you said, you think we as writers from a place of privilege have the right, we must try to bring those voices. For example, if a young Nigerian girl can have her voice written in a book, how do we help her? How do we help those writers who are not heard become heard and be published and all that. You think that is our responsibility or not?
Can I answer this one? Yeah. So, regarding the sensitivity readers, reading from a place that actually I don't consider privileged, maybe more now, but before it wasn't the case. Actually, I was more confronted to sensitivity publishers. I mean, the problem for me is less like what publishers think that actually is right and should be published, and what's actually plausible and what's believed. For instance, in my other novel, it's like 5 cross stories, and one of the stories is about a guy who's a rapper. One of the stories about a girl who's like higher middle class, she's a gothic. And so for the rapper, that was complete fiction. I'm a hip-hop fan, so I know a lot of rappers, hip-hop and so on, but I've never been a rapper. I don't intend to be. Just like I like the character and I like the vibe and the thing, and so it was really like work of fiction. But publishers were like, "Wow, yes, we can see that you really know that," and they were like, and I really had like a white card to be able to tell whatever I want. Same for like Muslim characters, ghetto characters, whatever. So like in the end, I was really more in a tricky position. That's what I said in my text. Like, am I allowed actually to depict in a caricatural way? Maybe, actually, maybe. Realities that are foreign to me, because I've been like foreign to any realities. I've been kind of like on the border, okay? So for me, it was more like, and for the white character, for the white girl, actually, it was more, less autobiographical in the sense of like, I've been to a fancy business school. And so actually I was describing real characters for real life. And then for those characters, publisher was saying to me, oh, it's really like a fantasy. We can tell that actually you don't know these realities. And so for me, it was really funny, because actually it was just a projection about what they believe I am. The same for this novel. Like, people believe that I'm like maybe a super devoted Muslim guy. Spirituality is important to me, but I'm not a practitioner. That's the case. But people now, like, they write articles thinking that I'm kind of representative of French Muslims. So, I mean, why not? So, but I know that for a long time I didn't want to write about it, because I thought that was not religious enough or Algerian enough or whatever to speak about it. So for me, the barrier was not like the readers, the barrier are the publishers. And so sensitivity readers, actually, I think that it's not a problem. I think every writer writing about something that he doesn't know very well should have second readers double-checking and saying, hey, does it make sense? To you, does it make sense? So, to women, to this. Because actually, it matters. I want readers to believe it. I want us to have the right conversation. And regarding the second question, which was like, the voice, like taking, like giving space to other voices. Actually, I observed a lot of like North African characters in novels written by French white people, and sometimes it's very bad, sometimes it's very good. I think it depends on the people. And for instance, Nicolas Mathieu, he was like a very famous novelist in France, and he wrote a novel that was really awarded and a very great novel. And in one of the characters, a French North African guy, and actually there were some stuff that were not accurate, but then I thought, well, you know what? It's interesting that he depicts this character this way, because it's another sensitivity to see this character, and actually there are things that I wouldn't have thought about. But I thought that it was an intelligent writing, because he's a great writer. So I can't really answer the question from a space of privilege, but I would answer more for the other side.
Louisa, you mean, your first question, you mean like before it's published, yeah, I think that's essential. So when I wrote the gay protagonist, yeah, I gave it to, my older friends, younger guys who are on Grindr, just to make sure I wasn't using, very different, like, I was writing about 1989, so these young guys didn't know anything about that, but it was interesting to talk about, gay men from the 70s, 80s, their stories. But I definitely gave, about 3 of them, because I was quite paranoid, because I get that wrong, the whole thing falls apart. So, I think that's an essential part of it. The second part was, you were saying, was it our responsibility to, look, if there is an Anne Frank story coming from a refugee and it lands in my lap, obviously I will champion it, but I mean, that's not really my, that's the publishing industry should be unearthing those stories. And I think the point for me is that these stories aren't 10 years after the war, we're getting one narrative, one official narrative. So therefore, I feel like, doesn't look like anyone else is writing it, so I should. But unearthing it, I don't know, I think that's maybe beyond the remit of the writer, but we should support it wherever we can. Yeah.
About the first one, I agree with Shehan. I think it's important to have that conversation. And not only with your editor, because maybe your editor is just like you. For example, my editor is a woman, same age, same, yeah. So you have to have that conversation, because if not, what is going to happen later is what happened with the book I'm talking about in my text. And it wasn't a very good thing to see, especially because the author she's a friend of mine actually, and it was horrible for her. And the novel is amazing. You have no idea, but all the racist thing around the novel was really bad for her. And about the second, I don't remember the question.
Giving the space, giving the platform to all the voices.
Helping to raise authors who are not.
Yeah. I think that the only responsibility you have as a writer is to do good literature. If you are doing good literature, you are doing a responsible thing, you know? Yeah, that's the only thing you have to think about. The other things will come naturally, yes.
Can you hold just one second?
Yeah, I'm going to make the uncomfortable question. So it's actually a question that is on the Sara's panel. It is possible to write the Notself without hurting other feelings, and if you like are always thinking when you're writing, oh, did I hurt this person by saying that, your freedom. You know, I know that we live in a world of political correctness now, like in these times. I think it's most than any other time that you have to be so politically correct. But at the same time, I feel like if we keep give the attention that we're giving to this topic, to the topic of be inclusive, just write the people, you know, what about if, I don't know, the people, let me put an example, you know, I would like to read a novel about you know, all the things that are wrong with Latinos, you know? And I think that could be a cool novel. That I don't know if, and maybe if, I don't know, a French guy who knows Latino people write about Latinos, and it's what if the novel is really good and it's really funny and absurd, and you know, a community of Latinos is oh, I don't like this novel because it said I don't know, the mothers of Latinos are really toxic or something like that, you know?
But
So,
Sara, you could write that. Could I write that?
well, if you could write
It
that.
sounds like my next novel.
But what about that? What about I don't know if you get the question, but
Yeah.
it's
No,
what
definitely.
about the freedom to be politically incorrect? There's good novels that are really politically incorrect, and there are great literature that pass through times. John Kennedy Toole, for example, is a great writer that do that. So, what about that?
Well, my novel that was mentioned, The Meek, is about a political trauma that still divides very much Bulgarian society. So I was aware that that a lot of people on both sides might be hurt or annoyed. And once again, that's a risk that the writers should take. I mean, yes, everyone has the right to be annoyed at a writer in the end. But in Bulgarian, we have a saying that translates basically as, if you're afraid of bears, you don't go to the forest. So yes, if you're all the time afraid of being politically incorrect, or if you're all the time afraid that you might get something wrong, you simply shouldn't write fiction in the end.
And maybe just to add on that, I think if you write from a place of discomfort, actually it means that maybe you're writing something good. And usually, if there is not some kind of discomfort, it's, for instance, like I was saying from my novel, like writing from a point of view of a very religious, a very religious character in a country where religion is kind of complicated nowadays. It was actually a place of discomfort, and above all, because myself I'm not super religious. But I knew that it was necessary. I knew that it was actually a good way to start, and I knew that actually I was very scared about the way it was received. It's like, maybe the very religious people would say, hey, who are you to tell about that? And the others, the French people that are very like, je suis Charlie, and are afraid of Islam, will be like, why are you advocating for Muslim people in France? Yeah, but I have to take the risk, because I thought that was good literature, and that was a story that needed to be told. Actually, it comes from a need. It's like, I'm not here to actually touring other people's life. When I write a story, it's because it comes from an inner need. I'm not doing a marketing plan. In like the day I start doing marketing plan, I don't write, I'm stop writing. Like I do something else.
I'm going to tell you something. If you are going to please everybody, you never are going to do good literature. Maybe you are going to feel others, you are going to hurt others' feelings, for sure. It is uncomfortable, yes, it is. For example, I have a good example for you. As a Colombian, you know, I'm completely sick about watch movies where all Colombians are in the mafia or selling drugs or consuming drugs and everybody has a gun. I'm sick of read books like that and watch movies like that or books like that. That's very uncomfortable for me. But as a writer, I have to accept that's how it works. Everybody is going to have, every writer or storyteller has the right to take whatever he wants and do it something with it, even if he is not Colombian. Now, if he do it well or bad, professionally or unprofessionally, that's another topic. Shehan wrote something very interesting. He said, my only excuse is that I do it well. So I think that if you do it well, you can do whatever you want.
See, I think one trick is, like, if you want to say horrible racist things, create a horrible racist character.
Yeah,
and then you're like, hey, I'm a sweet guy, but that guy's horrible. And I kind of did that, like, with this. I mean, this is quite an old book, but I went to, like, a reading group and it said, your characters are very misogynistic. And I was like, well, they're old men who grew up in the 60s and 70s. They're chauvinistic. I don't know if they hate women, but yeah, but I had that ability to say, yeah, I kind of, those are them, I'm not like that. So there is that trick where you can.
But you have the risk, like people are like, oh, Shehan is misogynistic because he created that character, blah, blah, blah. You have the risk.
And maybe it's going to happen, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, so that's the skill where is this racist being depicted sympathetically or not? And I think you should keep the author voice out of it as well. But also, I mean, there's a thing called permission, like definitely what you described. I could not get away with writing that book. But if I wrote about, Sri Lankan mothers, I mean, I'm writing a story about two aunties who go to funerals and just bitch about the corpse, like these two aunties. And I don't feel I need permission. I'll give my mom and my auntie to read it, and then they'll never know it's about them. That's the thing. You give it to the person based on it, they'll go, oh, this is quite an unpleasant character, but well done. So there is that. But I feel I wouldn't have permission to write about Latino and critique that. So there's a friend of mine, Andrew Fidel Fernando, great cricket writer. He's a travel writer, and in his book, it's Once Upon a Sleepless Isle, he writes about, and he critiques Sri Lanka all the way. He's traveling around Sri Lanka, talking about what the British did wrong, what Sri Lanka did wrong. But then he goes to some backpackers, and most of the backpackers are, yeah, you got a great country, man, it's awesome. But one guy from, I think it was from Finland, I'm sorry, but he's like, you know, you guys call yourselves Buddhist, but you're not Buddhist, you're just this. And he did like this critique of saying, you know, your hotel industry doesn't work properly, your people are rude, your waiters are rude, this, that. And Fidel had said exactly the same thing in his book, but he was like, what an ass. How dare he say that? That's for me to say. He can't like say it. And he kind of acknowledges his bias, saying like, I was annoyed at the guy, even though everything he said was absolutely true. And then like a British reviewer said, I've lived in Sri Lanka longer than Fidel, but if I wrote that book, you know, everyone would say, oh, it's some British pompous guy critiquing the natives. So this is a real thing, and I think, look, people say political correctness gone mad and all that, and you know, perhaps there are instances where it has, but I think, look, when Peter Sellers put brown shoe polish and did an impression, he didn't think anything wrong of it, and he was a very talented impressionist, and he thought, yeah, this is how my Indians talk, and I'm going to do it. But whereas now, I would think, and I think that's the gift here that, you know, at least now we're thinking, if I'm going to write a lesbian character, I better know what I'm doing. I can't just conjure up stereotypes in my head. So I think there are tricks around it. But yeah, you have to be aware that you can't just go in and do whatever. Yeah.
The American poet William Matthews has a poem where he says that he corrected his son's grammar, and his son replied, "Too correct." And that's, I think Natasha had a hand in it. That'll bring, okay.
Well, first I want to thank each of you for giving me the courage, bucking me up to try pushing this boundary harder than I have in the past. My question is, when you're striving to reach that other, is there a moment, a particular experience that you have when you realize, yeah, I've got it? Is there a certain point after, and I like Shehan's reference to listen, read, you know, listen, read, watch. And so I'm wondering if there's a moment or an experience where you have that feeling that, yeah, I think I can pull this off.
I think when the character starts talking to you, and that happens in any book, like you can intellectualize it and plot out the novel, but it's only like after about 50, 60 pages that the character starts talking and telling you stuff. And that's the sweet spot, whether you're writing the other or the self. And like for me now, say with the second book, making him a closet gay man, that happened quite early in the piece. But that's what really flipped it, because otherwise I felt like I was just writing, you know, a guy in his 30s, maybe he lived 20 years earlier, but I felt like it was just my voice. But making him the other helped me, because then I was listening to what he was saying. And then I think you reach a point in a novel where suddenly they are speaking, and they are using words that you wouldn't use. They're stating opinions that are actually offensive to you, perhaps. And I think that's the sweet spot when the character, but if you find yourself putting words in people's mouths and you're thinking, would they say this, then chances are you haven't got there yet. They should. I don't know, that's my experience.
Yeah, if I can add something on that, it's like, actually I prefer writing on the Notself, because I think it's more fun. And I think that in the end, when you start writing, it's because you want to have fun. Then after like editing 1,000 times, you will forget about it, but it's actually the first impulse. So I think at first, when you start with a character that is close to you, it's easier to start because you have like more elements. But then it's more tricky because it's like, as a fiction writer, you want it to be different from you. And sometimes you want to put, for instance, your thoughts in the head of the character. And actually, then you confuse it. So for me, for instance, for this novel, sometimes I really had to make the difference and say, hey, no, this character is not me. Is really different. It will not say, think, or do that. And so it was really tricky to really separate myself. While when I'm, for instance, building the character of the NGO director with a British Welshman, within his 50s, it was at first a bit more tricky. But then, once I got it, also like I had that little thing that I really want to root for the character, then things were like way better. Because I was like, as free as I was actually, I was letting him telling me actually what was happening. It was more like a conversation with the character. And so yes, like rooting for the character is a good like clue.
I think we have time, about 30 seconds left. I think Sylvia has the question.
Yeah, thank you for this discussion. It has been very interesting. Mine is more like a comment than a question. It's like a follow-up thing to what Pamela asked before. for me, the problem with like most mainstream fiction is the idea. I mean, Walid mentioned the word empathy earlier, and I understand it in a sense that you have to know your character in order to write about it. And now I'm not like talking about minorities or the others in a sense that it's like different from me, but like any character. For me, the problem is that that mainstream empathy, mainstream literature, especially in Finland, is like. That the quality of the literature is seen like deriving from the idea that the reader can feel empathy towards the characters, and for me that is like very problematic because it's not like artistically very interesting, because it's so easy to to have a story about a little girl and a landmine, and everybody's crying after that, of course, because it's very sad if a child dies, But for me it could be even more interesting to read stories where the writer is not treating the characters like very empathetically, but like more being like cruel or nasty towards the. I think that could create something that could be. I mean, I think that we put too much weight on the idea that literature should be like making the world a better place somehow, by making the readers cry because of these sad stories, and I don't really like that. I don't know if you what you think about this, but it's like something to maybe.
That's worth thinking about. Writers can be very nasty sometimes, and sometimes very nasty writers produce great literature.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
Empathy doesn't mean good intentions. Empathy just means like you could put yourself in the head of a serial killer and you truly understand his motives. For instance, I had a real character that I really tried trouble to enter in his head. Because it was after the attacks in Paris in 2015. And so for me, it was like, I could not understand why those people did that. But I had to kind of like dig into the story and dig into their head, in their stories. Like, okay, what would be the story? What could be the reason that actually would make it acceptable? And also it's very uncomfortable for me. So what's like empathy? It's not like, oh, the poor girl that we're going to rescue from poverty. No, it's like, the guy is evil. How do we get it?
And I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last word. We've gone over.